is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the program. Our top stories: the Israeli army pushes deeper into Gaza's second biggest city. Dozens of Palestinians have been killed in intense ground battles and airstrikes. A catastrophic situation for thousands of civilians as evacuation routes become battlefields. Aid groups say shelters are overflowing. Our other headlines: I'm sorry for the pain and the loss. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson apologises for his shortcomings at the UK COVID inquiry. And in the hottest year, 200 scientists warn climate change is pushing the planet towards dangerous tipping points. Heavy fighting is taking place right across Gaza, but particularly in the south, near the second largest city of Khan Yunis. Israeli forces say they've reached the heart of the city after the most intense day of fighting in its ground operation against the Palestinian armed group Hamas. Dozens of Gazans have been killed in artillery shelling and aerial attacks. Well, as the fighting intensifies, so does the suffering of the civilians in the besieged enclave. The United Nations says Palestinians are living in utter, deepening horror. Hundreds of thousands of people are under new evacuation orders in southern Gaza, but there's nowhere to go because shelters are overflowing. Hospitals are also at breaking point, and aid groups say conditions are rapidly deteriorating.
Situation is getting worse by the hour. I mean, like, there's intensified bombing going on all around, including here in the southern areas, Khan Yunis, and even in Rafah. Even what I've seen over the last couple of days, that we see an vastly increasing number of IDPs. I think we are closer by. It's humanity's darkest hour, and has been the message, I think, from WHO, the UN in general. This bombings and, I would say, a senseless loss of life must stop now.
Well, we have correspondents in Gaza and Israel in a moment. Sarah Coates in Tel Aviv. First to central Gaza and Noor Harazi. Noor, intense fighting continues in southern Gaza, and Israeli strikes have hit refugee camps. Just talk us through the latest attacks.
Well, let's begin with the latest from northern Gaza. Yes, the Israeli tanks withdrew from some areas in west and central Gaza. However, now there is intensive Israeli airstrikes and shelling on eastern and also northern Gaza, like Jabalia refugee camp, Ash-Shijaiya area. Paramedics and doctors in these areas are talking about hundreds of people that were killed, still stuck under the rubble of their homes, thrown in the street with no ambulances that are coming to evacuate them. The situation there is catastrophic. Also, the situation of the hospitals that are still operating there is also catastrophic. I mean, talking about the Al-Auda hospital, which is located in Beit Hanun, the doctors inside, they're saying that they have more than 100 patients, and the Israeli tanks are now surrounding the hospital. Talking about Kamal Udwan Hospital, which is also in the north, it is in Beit Lahia. The doctors there said that they have 10,000 Palestinian refugees taking shelter inside the hospital, adding to that the number of thousands of people who were injured. And also they talked about more than 100 bodies of Palestinians that were killed in the surrounding areas over the past days, and they cannot even bury them, even though they asked permission to bury them inside the hospital. So apparently what happened in the Shifa hospital is now repeating itself in northern Gaza. Also, there is intensive Israeli airstrikes and bombing in southern Gaza, specifically the second biggest city in Gaza, which is Khan Yunis this city, and Palestinians there actually they don't know where to go anymore, even though there is a new evacuation order. But people here on the ground, citizens, they don't know where to go. So we're seeing a small number of them actually relocating themselves.
As you say, more evacuation orders across the enclave. What's the situation like for displaced Palestinians in the camps and the shelters?
I mean, it's catastrophic. It's miserable. It's just going from bad to worse, especially that winter is approaching. It's really cold. There is rain every now and then, and most of the evacuation is happening in Al Mawasi refugee camp in East Khan Yunis, or the UN refugee camp in southern Rafah. And those places are actually like deserts, like a desert, and there's no infrastructure there. There is no running water, no electricity, no network, no food, nothing. So we're seeing people sitting there, tents on the sand, and that's the only thing that they can do. At the same time, it is impossible to evacuate all of those Palestinians inside southern Gaza to these places. And that's why, as I mentioned before, many of Palestinians have made the decision of staying where they are. For them, the word safe actually means that less Palestinians will be killed in that area than the dangerous areas. For example, let me just say something personal. For example, my family, they evacuated from their home in Al-Nasr in northern Gaza to the Al-Nasr hospital. 2 weeks there, and then they were forced to evacuate to Khan Yunis, 2 weeks there also in Khan Yunis, and now I'm working to evacuate them again to Deir al-Balah. So this is the third time they evacuate, and they're actually evacuate from a place that they were told to evacuate to.
Noor, thank you for that. Our correspondent Noor Harazin in Gaza. Sarah Coates in Tel Aviv. Israel's defense forces have given an update on their operation in Gaza. What have we heard?
Hi, Jamie. Well, look, the military says it is expanding its campaign inside the Gaza Strip, with heavy fighting continuing deep inside Khan Yunis. Now, the IDF says that over the last 24 hours, it has eliminated 4 senior Hamas commanders and also taken out more than 250 Hamas targets. But look, Jamie, this is also coming at a pretty heavy cost to the IDF. It has released the names of 2 more soldiers, bringing the total number of those killed in this combat on the ground up to 83. Now, the military also says heavy fighting is still continuing in the northern part of the Strip. It has released pictures of what it says is a military depot, a weapons depot, which was near a school. It's showing pictures there of a number of rockets, also guns and other explosive devices. Now, we've heard from the IDF spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, also. He is calling on the international community to do more to try and bring these hostages home, with that number revised now to 138.
This is an urgent call for action. The international community must take action. The Red Cross must have access to the hostages that are in the hands of Hamas. As the IDF expands its operations to dismantle Hamas in Gaza, we have not lost sight, not for one moment, of our critical mission to rescue our hostages, to do everything in our power to bring our hostages home.
But look, Jamie, these families do not believe what the army is saying. They do not believe what the government is saying when it says it's doing everything it can to bring these people back. They are furious, saying it needs to do more at whatever cost to bring these 138 people home right now.
So there have been allegations that some Israeli hostages were sexually abused by Hamas.
Yeah, you're certainly right. Well, look, some of these recently released hostages and also witnesses who were first responders down in the south on October 7, they are detailing some extremely graphic things of rape, also sexual abuse. Some of this far too graphic to detail on air. These people are saying the victims ranged from children up to elderly people. They were not just women, that they were also men. Now, we've heard from the US President Joe Biden. He is calling on the world to condemn without exception these accusations levelled at Hamas. And we do need to say that Hamas continues to deny these accusations. But look, we've also heard from another US official saying that Hamas is likely not freeing the rest of these female captives that are being held in the Gaza Strip simply due to the fact that it does not want them to come out to tell their stories. So look, this is extremely concerning, of course, for these families, as I said, of these people that are still being held in the Strip with no word yet on their welfare, their whereabouts, and still no visit from the International Red Cross. Jamie.
Sarah, thank you for that. Our correspondent Sarah Coates in Tel Aviv, and our thanks to our correspondent Noor Harazin in Gaza. Well, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has again called for de-escalation in Gaza in a phone call with the United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Wang says the priority is to stop the fighting. China says it's willing to work with all parties to try to resolve the conflict. Antony Blinken reiterated the need for efforts to prevent it from spreading across the region. China has denied it has deliberately pursued a trade surplus with the European Union. Beijing says it's not reasonable for the EU to enjoy China's market while imposing restrictions on the export of high-tech products to China. The response follows Commission President Ursula von der Leyen saying the EU will not accept a long-term trade imbalance with China. The China-EU Leaders' Summit will take place in Beijing on Thursday. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has arrived in Abu Dhabi en route to Saudi Arabia to discuss oil production and the conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine. The rare trip abroad will include a meeting with Saudi's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He was greeted in Abu Dhabi with a military flypast. Leaders of the G7 countries will reiterate their support for Ukraine when President Zelensky joins a video summit this afternoon, hosted by the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. The summit comes just a day after Zelensky unexpectedly cancelled his planned video link appearance with United States senators on Tuesday, in which he was to have appealed for continued funding. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is cross-examined at the COVID inquiry and apologises for his part in the country's pain, loss and suffering.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans, grey rhinos, and unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The green transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
For China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us.
And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
This is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. The Israeli army pushes deeper into Gaza's second biggest city. Dozens of Palestinians have been killed in intense ground battles and airstrikes. A catastrophic situation for thousands of civilians as evacuation routes become battlefields. Aid groups say shelters are overflowing. The former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he's deeply sorry for the pain, loss and suffering of victims of COVID-19. He faces 2 days of questionings at the inquiry into the government's handling of the pandemic. Previous witnesses, including former ministers and top scientists, criticised Johnson for his decision-making and his capabilities while he was in charge. His testimony was interrupted several times by members of the public.
Can I just say how glad I am to be at this inquiry, and how sorry I am for the pain and the loss and the suffering, that I understand the feelings of these victims and their families, and I am deeply sorry for the pain and the loss and the suffering of those victims and their families.
Well, our correspondent Yolo Abdavid is outside the hearing in London. Yolo, many things have been said about UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, many questions asked about his decision-making. Now it's his turn. What has he said?
Probably the most eagerly awaited part of this public inquiry into the impact of coronavirus in Britain. And also, it's not just the government, but it's the British state that's being questioned here. And of course, the leader at that time, between 2019 and 2022, was Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Now, as a former Prime Minister, it would have been uncomfortable for him, which is why possibly he arrived at 7 a.m., 3 hours before the proceedings started. He did say, under questioning from the lead counsel who are investigating this, Hugo Keith, KC, he did say that he should have twigged how serious the virus was sooner than he did. There was an edgy exchange over that period, that he didn't seem to be involved that much from the middle of January until the end of February. He said he was really rattled when he saw and realized the impact of the outbreak in Italy, for instance, and he should have realized sooner. He defended himself, because he was questioned repeatedly. He defended himself on why he didn't chair 5 consecutive COBRA meetings. COBRA meetings are all the senior leaders in terms of decision-making in an emergency. And there was also the question about missing WhatsApp messages, and he failed to recollect, or there was an untruth in what he said, and he was pointed out by Mr. Keith that actually those messages were direct to him, not to a group WhatsApp message. In his defense, as you said, he said that he tried to manage the pandemic as best as he could, and so did the government. And it was important to try and defend the lockdowns. So he said he and his government did the best they could at that time.
Inevitably, we got some things wrong. I think we were doing our best at the time, given what we knew, given the information I had available to me at the time. I think we did our level best. Were there things that we should have done differently? Unquestionably.
Yes, so a qualified response there, but of course there are far more questions coming his way this afternoon and tomorrow that will really ask him to think again if more should have been done.
Yolo, we heard heckling earlier on. Members of the public are attending this hearing, including relatives. What have they been saying?
Yes, well, you heard that heckling in that short clip of Boris Johnson. 4 of them were asked to leave by Baroness Heather Hallett, the chair of the inquiry. They were asked to leave. There was also another interruption slightly later as well. And people think that this is just about those who've died during COVID, the deceased. It's not. It's also about people who are living with long-term COVID and people who have disabilities, they claim, because of it. There was also a very noisy anti-vaccination group here as well earlier today. So the debate about the impact on people and the number of deaths I felt very, very strongly. There were two press conferences almost immediately straight after the proceedings broke out at lunchtime. And during one of those impromptu lunch breaks, press conferences, we had the solicitor for the bereaved families in the UK with a very strong statement to all the journalists here.
Mr. Johnson apologised today, but that apology is not accepted by many of the bereaved because he also claimed his government saved thousands of lives, and that for many is a grotesque distortion of the truth. Mr. Johnson tried his very best to deny his government's failings meant that the UK had one of the highest COVID death rates of all major economies, but that is the evidence.
And that is really crucial, that the death rate here in the UK was second only to Italy in Western Europe. He seemed to not accept that. He argued about that. And even now, 3.5 years since the beginning of COVID, it shows the depth of the anger and also the extent of people's frustration with his premiership. Jamie.
Yolo, thank you for that. Our correspondent Yolo Abdavid outside the COVID hearing in London. Europe's climate monitor has declared that 2023 will be the hottest on record, as a new report paints a grim picture of what the coming decade could look like. The Global Tipping Point paper concludes humanity faces devastating domino effects from global warming. This as the United States climate envoy John Kerry addressed the COP28 climate summit.
We need to emphatically accelerate the pace of emission reductions. That is the only way to keep 1.5 degrees alive.
Let's talk to our correspondent Radhika Bajaj in Dubai. Radhika, what are the key recommendations from this Global Tipping Point report?
Hi there. So, of course, one of the biggest recommendations is the phasing out of fossil fuels by 2050. And this report essentially talks about 5 important natural thresholds already being crossed and 3 more that may be reached by 2030 if the world heats over 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. And these 5 tipping points that have been talked about in the report include the collapse of big ice sheets in Greenland and the West Antarctic, the widespread thawing of permafrost, the death of coral reefs in warm waters, and the collapse of one oceanic current in the North Atlantic. And what the report says is that when such climatic shifts happen, it's not just about hotter surface temperatures or flooding because of a severe rainfall. The entire operation of the planet, how our planet works, is permanently altered. To that end, the first recommendation, like I said, was phasing out of fossil fuels, and the report says that a rapid end to land use change emissions and shift to worldwide ecological restoration are also needed. Countries need to reassess their highest ambitions accordingly, particularly wealthy, high-emitting nations. The second recommendation is to strengthen adaptation and loss and damage governance. The report says that the impact of these tipping points will be most felt by vulnerable nations and communities within and between nations, and that there will be knock-on impacts on global inequality, the global economy, as well as geopolitics. This report says that an urgent impetus is required to strengthen the adaptation and loss and damage governance in the UNFCCC. Now, besides these recommendations, there are also suggestions on including the tipping points in the NDCs, also holding a global summit and including these tipping points when it comes to multinational forums like the G20 in Brazil next year. The other point is to deepen the knowledge of tipping points and its translation into action as well. And if we were to tie back these recommendations to what's happening at COP, today we saw the UN climate chief, Simon Style, holding a press conference where he has said that all governments must give their negotiators clear marching orders. And he says we need the highest ambition, not point scoring or lowest common denominator politics. He says that there are many options that are on the table right now which speak to the phasing out of fossil fuels, and that it is important for parties to unpick that but come up with a very clear statement that signals the terminal decline of the fossil fuel era as we know it. Now, besides this strong statement, we also had word coming in from the EU Climate Commissioner, also a former executive of the oil company Shell, who also seemed fairly uncompromising in his demand for a complete and urgent phase out of all fossil fuels. So as far as the commentary on the ground is concerned, it of course ties in with the recommendations that have been given by the Global Tipping Point report. And on the loss and damage fund, it's interesting to note that environmentalists say that while we have seen billions of dollars going into the fund at this COP, and the good news, of course, is it was operationalized on the first day itself. They say you look back to 2015 when hundreds of billions of dollars were promised into climate action. That money has still not come in. And while recommendations and headlines are, of course, being made, it will be very, very critical to see at this juncture.
Radhika, thank you for that comprehensive overview. Our correspondent, Radhika Bajaj, in Dubai. Nigeria's president has ordered an investigation into a military drone attack that killed at least 85 people. Bola Tinubu called the attack on a Muslim festival in the state of Kaduna very unfortunate and disturbing. Security forces were targeting armed gangs in the area. The army chief apologized and promised to pay hospital costs for the injured. Survivors are heading back to what's left of their homes after flash floods swept through northeast Tanzania on Saturday. At least 63 people were killed and more than 100 injured. Rainstorms have been pounding East African countries since October, killing hundreds in Kenya and Somalia. Talks between German government coalition partners failed to reach agreement on how to plug an $18 billion hole in next year's budget. This means Parliament is now unlikely to approve a 2024 budget by the end of the year, leaving the funding for environmental projects, social benefits and local authorities in limbo. Venezuela's President Nicolás Maduro has ordered the country's state-owned companies to immediately begin mining in Guyana's contested Essequibo region. In a referendum on Sunday, Venezuelans voted to claim sovereignty over the area, which is twice the size of Ireland. Residents of Guyana announced the poll, which some fear is a pretext to annexation of the region. China has successfully completed its first ever space launch in the South China Sea. The satellite for China's space internet system has reached the target orbit. The mission was carried out by the Tianwan Satellite Launch Center. The headlines again. The Israeli army pushes deeper into Gaza's second biggest city. Dozens of Palestinians have been killed in intense ground battles and airstrikes. Our other headlines: a catastrophic situation for thousands of civilians as evacuation routes become battlefields. Aid groups say shelters are overflowing. And former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson apologises for his shortcomings at the UK COVID inquiry. And that is The World Today. Thank you for watching. There's more on CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app, or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone. We're back with more news at the top of this hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.